Carving 101 today is from Base Camp at Dust Devil Mining Company, the famed Dust Devil Mining Company outside of Plush, Oregon. This one is a nice clean stone, doesn't have any internal fractures, and I've already got a nice flat surface for the window to look into the stone. The back side of it is a little bit domed. It's got a few fractures and inclusions that we can smooth off, and to do the reverse intaglio I like a little bit of a dome on the back. So it was a really good preform to start with. And just do a little bit of sanding across the top and polish it for a window. Look down into the piece. And then we'll round off the outside and give it some kind of shape, probably a little bit of a pear shape. What I like to do is save as much of the shape of the crystal as we can. So it's going to be a little bit of a free-form pear, but I like graceful lines, so we'll try to give it a little bit of interest. And then I'll round the back off with a little bit of a dome, and then we can do some reverse intaglio carving on the back side. I always like roughing it out with this coarse grit. With Sunstone, you really don't have to worry too much about chipping. Just speeds the process up a little bit. And all you're doing with this coarse grit, which is about a 220 grit, is you're just shaping everything. You're going to have to get back and do a little bit more fine tuning. You want to make sure there's no little pits. So we got the outside shape and the front of it shaped. Now I'm going to kind of half dome the back side of it. I'm looking to see the little fractures. I'm trying to cut all of the fractures off from the natural crystal. I've got one little tiny area here that I need to do a little bit more. So I've almost got the nice little rounded curve. The sides are all fracture free, and the table doesn't have any fractures on it, which we had a nice flat to begin with. But just touch up this one little spot, and then we can move over to the next grit wheel for a little bit finer sanding. Okay, now that you got rid of all of that, you still see a few little kind of faceted lines from a coarse grit wheel. So we're going to move over and do a little bit finer sanding, or a little finer grinding with a 600 grit wheel. And what I tell people is don't stay in one spot on the wheel, because you end up wearing a groove. You go from all the different areas of the wheel. Sometimes a well-worn wheel, you can actually get better cutting action on the outsides, because everybody has a tendency to stay on the middle of it. When you do an outside perimeter of a stone, you want to just try to have a nice rolling action. Just the fingers primarily, to minimize the little flat spots. Okay, what I've done is just smoothed it up a little bit with a finer grit. This is a 600 grit wheel that's diamond plated, so it's still a pretty aggressive wheel. This next wheel should be a 600 grit, but it's a resin bonded wheel. It has a little bit of foam backing on it to give you some resilience. And that's where, when you see the little kind of flat faceted lines, from doing a cab. This is where you're going to start rounding those lines off into a nice smooth cab. And don't hesitate to, bear down into the wheel a little bit, because you're pushing in that rubber and you get a nice curvature to the sanding surface that goes across the top. And what gives you a nice even round surface is keep turning the thing, rolling a lot of different directions. Each individual will work out a special little wrist action that works better for them, but you just want to make sure you're moving around a lot of different directions. And again, you do all of the same surfaces you do around the outside. A nice little pendant piece. This is when you need to start thinking about somebody that's going to set the stone. So right now what I have is a sharp ridge across the top surface, and with a 600 grit wheel I'm just going to barely knock that ridge off after I flat the top of it again. That'll provide an area for you to hook it with a prong. So now I'm just going to put a little 45-degree bevel, and it doesn't take much to go all the way around the stone. This is probably one of the most important stages. When you're on a 600 grit wheel, you want to make sure every single grind line from the two previous wheels has disappeared, because you're not going to be able to polish through those. So you want to give it a good careful inspection. If there's any areas, I've got one little area here that's still a little bit faceted, so I'll just touch it up a little bit. We're going to take it from 600 to 1200, and 1200 is actually a good pre-polish. This 1200 and 3000 grit makes a nice pre-polish. You'll actually see the stone looking really shiny, but from that you can go directly to a polish and it'll bring up a really high shine. Probably see from a 600 grit it still has kind of a frosted look about it. But after we get done with the 1200 grit, it'll start to look shinier. You just want to make sure you cover all the same surfaces. You can't stay in one spot too long, or you'll end up starting to sand little flat spots. So you want to make sure you develop a good rolling action. The easiest way is to put it on a dop stick where you can hang on to it, but a little bit of experience, you can get pretty good at hanging on to it. You just don't want to get your fingers in the wheel too often, because it will actually sand your skin off, and next thing you know you're bleeding a little bit, and that's not a good thing. Now the rule here is you cut a little bit and you look a lot. What you're looking for is any tiny little areas that you haven't sanded to completion before you move over to the next wheel. If you've got any issues at all, you've got to get rid of them now. That's same principle applies for faceting as well as cabbing. You certainly can't beat the hospitality and camaraderie that happens within the Dust Devil community. Carving 101 today is from Base Camp at Dust Devil Mining Company, the famed Dust Devil Mining Company outside of Flush, Oregon. Okay, now I'm going to move over to the final sand, which should be 3000 grit. Now, 3000 grit's usually considered a pre-polish, so you want to spend plenty of time on this wheel in order to get the best results in a polishing stage. You want to make sure everything has actually a nice shine to it by the time you finish with this wheel, and then polishing just works so much faster. You can see it's starting to take on a nice little shine to it. Like I say, this is a stage that you want to make sure there's no grind lines or anything visible. It should actually have kind of a really slightly frosted polish to it, but no grind lines of anything visible. If they are, you need to work them out. So you may want to work this stage with Optivisor or magnification. Shop I have at home, I've got a little air hose, and you get these stones wet and then you can't see it and you're sitting here trying to dry it off with a towel, and the towel's a little bit wet. If you just hit it with an air hose, you can blow the water off of it real quick and speeds things up a little bit in terms of inspection. These genies are good pieces of equipment, but the one thing I don't really care for is this sometimes will vibrate back and forth. You want to make sure it's always giving you good water lubrication. One of the things that you have to watch for in sunstone is the growth lines of the crystal, and sometimes if you're parallel to those growth lines you can actually end up with little tidbits that pull away. So if you go across that grain, sometimes you can prevent that. So there's a little area where I've rounded it that I'm experiencing a problem when I'm parallel to it, turning it the other direction, they completely go away. It's a little easier to sand off. This particular stone, I've probably only lost about 25% to 30%, primarily because it was a good preform to begin with. If I take a stone like this right here, you can see it's got a nice flat. I won't lose a whole lot getting the flat real nice where you can look into it as a window. But if I were to make this a pear shape, you're going to lose a significant portion of it. So doing a stone like this, you're probably going to end up with about 50% return, which is still not bad. This last step is one that there is one inherent problem. These genies are excellent pieces of equipment, but one of the inherent problems that you run into with the genie in this last stage, which this is a 14,000 grit, is contamination. Contamination is probably the #1 culprit in people not getting a good polish on their gemstones. So I always recommend a completely separate polishing unit just for polish. The very best way to polish is you can take this end wheel off and you'll get to the threads. These are actually made to go on a genie. You're better off putting one of these on the genie that's a pretty thick felt buff, and take a little bit of serum oxide powder and a spray bottle. And what I like to do is mix just a little bit of the serum oxide in with the solution itself, or you can mix in a little container, kind of a pasty amount of it. It looks a little bit like toothpaste, just pretty thick consistency, and you take just a little bit as the wheel is rotating around, and you want to charge the wheel, and that way you're pretty much contaminant free. You're not spraying up little bits and pieces on the 14,000 grit wheel. But we've gone through the magic of television. The problem with this one is if you've ground on these two previous sanding stages, you've got all these little tiny particles, and the way this is designed, it shoots up a little spray of water. Now you're shooting those up onto the 14,000 grit wheel, and that little particle, as it drags across, could end up giving you a scratch. So I always recommend people change the water out, but we're going to see how this works because I've started with fresh water to begin with. It'll actually give us pretty good results for base camp, which is not a bad thing. In a lapidary shop, I always recommend people be a whole lot more careful with cross-contamination. When you're actually able to go down into the pit and you see just how difficult it is to dig the sunstone to begin with, it gives you an appreciation for the value of the sunstone, gives you an appreciation for how much hard work all of the dust devils put into mining the sunstone. You certainly can't beat the hospitality and camaraderie that happens within the dust devil community. I'm going to show you the corner of my studio where I have my goldsmithing set up, and I will just go through a small walk around. It's a tight little spot. I've got everything convenience group where I can easily reach things. Over here I've got a polishing machine. I keep rouge separated from Tripoli. Got gloves here to use with that piece of equipment. Over here I've got a little bit coarser polishing buff, and right here I've got a grinding wheel. Then I've got a steam generator. This generates steam. I'll just tap the button. This is what I use for cleaning jewelry. Hold it with rubber tongs. And I've got a nice clean sink. This is important to always keep your work environment as clean as possible. Right here I've got an ultrasonic cleaner that I can set with a timer. I've got a jar in the middle here that I put ammonia for actually cleaning the jewelry. I've got my cleaning supplies up here. Nice light above it where I can see things. Got a good towel here to keep things nice and clean and wash up. Then over on the other side of the shop, I've got back here in the back, I've got an oven, a little toaster oven. I use this for various enameling projects, and sometimes I use it for vulcanizing rubber molds. Then this piece of equipment here is a rolling mill. It's got an area to do flat stock and square stock. This is what I use to fabricate metal and bend it to the bend it and squish it to the shape that I want. Then right here I've got a wax injector so that I can inject waxes. This happens to be a bluebonnet mold. That's a state flower of Texas. And I've got a brass die. This is the state seal of Texas. And a couple of other little pieces and parts that I use for Texas related jewelry. I've got some water here to quench things off. Got the pickle solution for using when I do the goldsmithing. I've got a swing away microscope that comes over my workstation. This is my main workstation. This piece of equipment has an interchangeable section. I can put wooden bench pans, raise it and elevate it for when I'm using just an optivisor. Doing work with a microscope, I can pull this off, set it down in place. This locks everything, gives me a real solid surface to work from. I've got some soldering tweezers that I can move in just about any position. I've got a separate soldering plate that I can actually attach here. And across the bench I've just got a lot of the tools, little tweezers, calipers, pliers, and little needle files, a couple of crucibles, and I've got a block here that I'll typically put the grinding burrs and sanding discs and things that I'm using for the immediate project, so they're close at hand. Then I've got convenience grouped a few things, like this is my solder drawer. That's what I keep all of my little gold solders, silver solders, platinum solders in, so they're close at hand. And then I've got a drawer for scrap gold, little bits and pieces that we'll use today doing the two projects that we have. Got some engravers and burnishers and sharpening stone here. That's close at hand. We'll use those quite a bit. And I've got various ring mandrels and little tiny tools that we'll use for parts of the project today. Got a drawer with sanding disc. You want to keep this conveniently located. And some bigger tools, pliers, hand files for some of the filing processes. I'm right-handed, so I have those located where I can easily grab them with the right hand. And then up here I've got a little torch. This is what I'll use for the fabricating and soldering stages. And then I've got two motors for a flex shaft. I have two different hand pieces on these. This one is a quick release. This is the main workpiece that I use so that I can quickly change from one bit to the next. And this piece has a Jacob's chuck, and I've got an attachment, an all-set attachment on it where I can precision set diamonds and gemstones. One of the things that is really important in a goldsmith shop is to have a nice chair. Now, albeit this may not be the fanciest chair that you've ever seen, but one of the most important things is to make yourself comfortable. Everybody is built a different way. I've got this chair set up where it's very comfortable for me. You're going to be sitting for long hours and very tedious hours at that. So you want to make sure that your chair fits you. The next thing you want to make sure is that your bench is at a height that's very comfortable for you. You want to be able to sit as upright as possible rather than hunched over, and have your collection tray just above your lap here where you're not pinched. From this position I can swing my microscope into place and do a lot of precision work in a very comfortable upright position. That's a key element in making yourself feel comfortable. You'll be able to work for a little bit longer period of time, and that makes the whole experience a lot more pleasurable. Hello, my name is Dalan Hargrave. I'm here at the Dust Devil Sunstone mine, where we find a beautiful gem sunstone. It's a feldspar. It often has nice little bars of schiller with little copper flakes and platelets that reflect the light. You can find beautiful red color sunstone. You can find green sunstone. You can find red sunstone in the middle with just a little bit of green around the outside of that. We call that watermelon sunstone. For this series, we're going to be looking at several different projects. We're going to do cabochons, similar to little round ones that we have here in the tray. We've got a nice diamond-shaped cab. We'll talk about the different stages to just make a nice, well-shaped cab and orient the sunstone and the schiller properly. Then we'll actually do a little free-shaped carving where we have just a few graceful lines, very simple carving that anybody can do in their shop with minimal equipment. And we'll once again talk about how to orient that in that project, orient the schiller and orient the color so that it faces up properly. And then also in the series we'll get into a little bit more in-depth project where we take a larger piece of sunstone and actually trim it, whittle it down to the nice blocky piece of material with no imperfections, and discuss a little bit of the design and how we arrive at the design for the piece. We'll do a little bit of a floral design for this piece, and then in another project we'll discuss cutting a little round sunstone that we'll actually use for the centerpiece of this floral display. This is a rare privilege to be able to carve one this size, and I'm looking forward to taking this back to the studio and see what we can make of this. Hopefully we'll make a treasure that somebody can pass on from generation to generation. So let's head to the studio and see what we can make of it.